Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with four different guests, and we're going to talk about a very important issue. I think we're going to do idealistic or Thomistic idealism. Is it possible? We're trying to marry the two ideas together and see if there's some common ground, and maybe we need to update Thomism, maybe update idealism, who knows? So I'm just really excited to be here with everybody. I think I have a very, as close as I can get to an expert panel, a lot of bright minds here. And just to kind of tell you my story about why I'm interested in the subject, Kyle, he has the YouTube channel, Christian Idealism. A while back, I didn't really take idealism seriously. I just thought like it was this kind of voodoo crazy idea. And then the more I started studying quantum theory, the more I talked to John Konnor, and just all the different objections and questions about classical theism, I started realizing that, maybe like traditional Thomism really does need an update. So that's kind of what I want to explore today. How can we improve the traditional model of God, and what kinds of metaphysics can both sides kind of gift to each other? So I'm going to let everybody just introduce themselves. Let's start with Kyle, then we'll go to John, then Jacob, then Johan. All right, so if you guys forget the order along the way, I can direct us back. But Kyle, you go first.
All right, my name's Kyle Alander. I run the YouTube channel called Christian Idealism, and my specialty is mainly just philosophy of mind. Sometimes philosophy of religion, but mainly just philosophy of mind, kind of defending the idealist position, and also defending the existence of God and all that good stuff. Right now, I'm working on a series. It's called The Foundation Theory, and I'm not going to spoil it, but basically I kind of go over what the foundational reality is and kind of how my theory of the foundation can explain why things exist. And then I also, a previous video series that I did in the past is called the Quantum Hermeticism series, and it's based on this book that I got. And you can watch for yourself, but I'm hoping that I can kind of bring forth, because there's a lot of interesting ideas in that book and in the series that can kind of help to explain like certain religious doctrines. So I hope that could be helpful for today's discussion.
All right, John.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my name's John Konnor, and I studied pharmacy. I studied pharmacy math. I have a diploma in social work, and I've been studying Thomism, logic, and philosophy now for about 15 years on my own. I had a little bit of tutoring, and I took some philosophy at school, at university. But basically, I came to getting this model of reductive hylomorphic idealism from studying the Catholic mystics and studying Thomism and philosophy. So that's basically my background on it. I've been, I read this stuff daily. I do logic daily. I read physics daily. I studied chemistry and math for quite a long time. So that's my background, basically.
All right, yeah, and I've had John on the show before, and I've also had Kyle on, so it's nice to have you guys on again. All right, Johan, first-time guest, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Johanan. Raatz. I run a channel with the same name. I'm actually kind of the guy who got the ball rolling on quantum idealism originally. It was some years ago now, but I kind of got these. I got this thing from a guy named Thomas Campbell, who is a NASA physicist, and he was giving some talks on basically how quantum gravity, which is the pursuit to try and marry quantum mechanics and relativity, requires that we model the universe as a virtual reality. And he showed examples like Einstein said that, he had a letter to David Bohm saying that in order to make sense of, they didn't have a theory, but they narrowed down what the problem was. And he said, in order to have a quantum gravity theory, we had to find a way to get rid of space-time and replace it with some more fundamental thing, but he had no idea what that would be. And then later on, some people were saying, well, they realized through certain studies of, say, black hole information paradoxes and so on, that has to be information. And now, on face value, if you think of, someone comes along on the street. I mean, you said the first time you ran into idealism, you thought this is kind of this crazy view, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you run into the street, some guy says, hey, dude, what if we're all in the Matrix, right? Or what if we're all like, what if this is all a dream? You're thrown to like look at them and like either say, get out of here, you crazy hippie, or hi, what are you smoking? I'd like some of that, right? So no, that sounds completely crazy at first. However, what happens instead of some crazy guy in the street saying it? What happens if you have a very advanced, top of the line physicist, like a world famous physicist in the area of quantum gravity say it, and then you have not just one say it, but you have multiple ones saying it all across the board, and then them saying this is the consensus that at the fundamental, we all disagree on different things in quantum gravity, but the one thing that everyone in the field agrees on is that space is illusion, an illusion or immersion or so on. You would suddenly sit back and like say what? You take you aback. And when I saw the lecture, the video by Tom Campbell, I took it like, because I had a little bit of training in philosophy. I did it as a minor before I went to Biola. My major was physics. I looked at this, I'm like, well, this is idealism. That's what this is. It's idealism. And I took this and I'm like, this is very powerful because I can, I knew that the whole basis for the theist versus atheist debate was essentially dualism versus materialism. And I did not like dualism because of the interaction problem, and it seemed like magic and all this. And I'm like, it never sat well with me, but I didn't really have a good option. I had kind of a prototype of what you call idealism, but I didn't think of it as idealism back then. It was a kind of an information monism, but I hadn't thought of it as a virtual reality model yet. But when I saw this, I'm like, oh, well, this is just idealism. And I realized I can swing the atheists out of the ballpark with this. And then I started doing this on YouTube, and Inspiring Philosophy picked it up. And then next thing you know, some guy in Kansas found it, and he then says, you have to be J.P. Moreland. And next thing you know, I'm studying philosophy at Biola. Yeah, so, and one other thing that was very interesting that we'll get to with Kyle a little bit later, he said he made this series on the quantum hermetica, right? That was something I'd like to talk about that too. I managed to obtain a PDF copy of it, but there was a video I made earlier this year. Originally, when the quantum hermetica came out, it was, I think, in 2018. Some people were passing it around, and I was kind of having getting over like a depressive episode in biology due to certain unresolved personal issues I had when I was much younger. And so I was just like, oh, there's this interesting thing some people were passing around in my, my group. And I didn't think anything of it. And I'm like, okay, I just let it go. And then earlier this year, I made a video on, could autonomous agents exist beneath emergent space-time? You might have seen it or not. And then someone a little bit later made a blog about my video, and they compared it to stuff in the quantum hermetica, and they said this is essentially hermetic occult science. And I'm like, I read the blog, I'm like, what? And I saw the book, and I'm like, and it was, I almost suspect it's like someone who probably has seen either my videos or Inspiring Philosophy videos more likely, because he has more subscribers. But it was using a physics framework that was very similar to ours. And what's very fascinating about this is that they've shown these basically this is like occult philosophy, right? And what they've shown is they have these principles that occult philosophy operates by. And it's not just principles; it's down. You've heard the term occult science before, right? And that's literally because they treat it as a science. They have each of the principles actually breaks down to very fine-tuned details. And when you look at the fine-tuned details, we'll get to some of that later, it's apparent that they're identical to some of the physics that we have, or at least they look like they're parallel. I don't want to claim that this is the same thing because it's kind of out there, but you can kind of see the parallels and just, examine it for yourself and be like, what is that?
Yeah. Were you recommended to J.P. Moreland because of his work on consciousness, or why did someone try to push you in his direction?
Someone tried to push me in this direction. It was kind of funny. He set up a meeting because he set up a conference it was an apologetics conference in Nebraska, not Kansas, sorry, it was in Nebraska, And it was funny. He insisted that I come to the meeting. Okay. like absolutely insisted. And then he told J.P. Moreland that he had to come to the meeting, but only under the condition that he talked to me. So he put the two of us together. Yeah, and I blew J.P. Moreland's mind, and he's like, "You have to come study philosophy with us at Biola."
Oh, well, he got you, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Johan. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's move on now to Jacob, and then we'll get right into our questions. All right, Jacob.
Hi, yeah. My name is Jacob Power, and I just have a YouTube channel by the same name. I'm pretty spontaneous. I'll just think of something, I'll make a video on it. You might see me around in the comment sections a lot, and philosophy channels and stuff. I kind of got into idealism a couple of years ago, and then more recently, I've been getting into Thomism, and I've been trying to synthesize the two because I see a lot of similarities between them. And one of the reasons also is because I'm Catholic, and so I like idealism, but a lot of Catholic philosophers and Catholics, they kind of poo-poo idealism, and I think that's a mistake. So that's essentially where I'm at.
All right. Well, that's a great, nice little quick start. All right. So the first question that I have on the docket here is to the idealists. I think it's really important that you guys just introduce the idea to us, to the audience. So what is idealism, and like what version do you espouse? Just give us the kind of like the introduction that we would need in order to understand. And I'm sure like maybe like it's like all four of you guys are like kind of sold on some form of idealism. Maybe you can mention the disagreements that you guys have, the differences, but what's the core kind of reality that you're posing to us? So whoever wants to take that first. Yeah.
Idealism is basically the idea that everything is of mental ontology. So, you have materialism where everything is made of little bits of matter, and dualism is it's not monistic, so therefore it has two types of substance. There's one that's fundamental mind, another one that's fundamental matter. And the idealism we have is, well, we would say everything is mental ontology, which doesn't mean everything is necessarily, but it's minds or ideas.
So, so I guess an important distinction to make is when we say everything's like a mind or an idea, we're not saying it's our personal minds. Right. We're saying that it's just mind in general. So it could be our minds, it could be God's mind. Bernardo Kastrup, he's an idealist philosopher. He calls it basically transpersonal thoughts and feelings or whatever. Basically, the world that's out there is just transpersonal thoughts and feelings. And that's basically the idea, because we still hold to an objective reality, right? It's just that objective reality is still mental. So
yes, that's a very important thing what Kyle just raised, is that we don't have some people associate idealism with the idea that everything is subjective. There is no, whatever you see, there's nothing behind it, as it were.
Right.
We think there is something behind it. That something is just mental ontology stuff. So
right. I think that's a good explanation of saying behind it, having stuff behind it, because a lot of people will just assume idealism is sort of anti-realist. And David Chalmers, he actually has an essay about idealism, and he brings up this point where he says a lot of the arguments against idealism are against anti-realist idealism. And really, he talks about this realist idealism where, there is this sort of external world that is real, but it has mental ontology. It's not anything, other in a sense.
There's a very interesting point about this too, which can be flipped around very quickly. And I'm not certain how, I shared an image on my screen, but I don't know how to share independent images. It would be useful if I could do that. If I can find the image, that is. Anyway, I've actually been able to show using epistemology that epistemology and its relation to ontology, that, believe it or not, in order to have, because people assume, this is anti-scientific, right? Because it's science presupposes realism. This is not realist. You can't have it. And so, well, the funny thing about this is, well, number one, you kind of know there's something wrong with this because we're getting this from a physics direction, right? If physics is telling us this, then obviously it's compatible with science. We have, in fact, entirely scientific formulations of idealism, which is kind of the cool improvisation, because before this, theists would be having arguments about God or for God, and it would be philosophic, and they would, the atheists come along and show me your evidence, and
right.
Count as evidence. Ha ha ha! I demand some science. I'm like, okay, very
holographic universe, man.
Yeah, well, I took it past the holographic universe. I did the whole, you go from the holographic universe to space-time being emergent from quantum entanglement.
Right. As soon as you do that, that's it. Yeah.
That's it, because then you simply identify entanglement with consciousness via integrated information theory or conscious realism and so on, or just plain quantum cognition, and you like voila, space emerges from consciousness, and it's a physics theory.
Ooh.
And it's a completely physics argument. Like you can make a physics model of God.
Yes, that's exactly what you can do.
Yeah, John, could you explain kind of the whole idea that's just been kind of given to us, the holographic universe, entanglement and consciousness, kind of unpack that for us?
Yeah, basically what I syncretized Thomism, and I brought it together and I married it with string theory and emergent space-time. So I got Jungianism and existential Thomism. So basically, I would say under digital Jungian Thomism, you'd have essences that exist, where the Thomists would say essences don't exist. But under this ontology, essences exist as code. So you'd be saying essences exist as types and tokens under composite modules of essay or information. So it's like what Thomists say is that God is sustaining the universe with modes of essay. So like essay commune would be the existence that's sustaining the ends commune, which is the beings of the natural theology. So what I'm saying here, the essay, information, and the soul minds are entangled with the emergent space-time robust abstract math structure Tegmarkian body. So what we're saying is it's like a quantum traveling forms, a Prussian version, right? So you have the souls and the minds are entangled with the bodies. The bodies are information, and you get the interaction problem solved by the quantum teleportation, which is assisted by entanglement. So that's what makes idealism so practical, because hylomorphic idealism really doesn't make sense, because you have this thing saying, well, the ends participate with God, but how's that participation happening? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, so we're jumping a little ahead with Thomism, but I'm going to bookmark that, because that is something I would like to talk about. Maybe to anyone else, even Johan, does that check out, or like, just what do you think about that so far, how John articulated it?
Some of it, I'm not entirely familiar with some of the metaphysical concepts he has, but actually I'll get to that in a second. I was kind of bypassed. I went sidestepped and went into like the physics component of it, but there's a strong argument you can make from just epistemology and using Kant's mnemonic phenomenon distinction that the only way to bridge your senses with an outside.
I actually have the argument. I had Jacob.
The only way to, it's the basis for the foundationalist argument, but the only way to bridge your senses, I mean, in order to have science, okay, you have to have some way to bridge your senses with an outside world, right? Otherwise, you're just stuck with solipsism. You can't know that anything really, I mean, of course, this is at a practical level, this is just like a stupid question. It's like, who cares? Let's do science, right? But if you want to do philosophy of science and say, well, how is it possible to have science happen in the first place, right? You have to have some way for your senses to go beyond your senses to an outside world they correlate to, so that therefore, when you have sensations of things, you're then making the empirical measurements of the outside world rather than just being stuck in some solipsistic delusion. And it turns out the only way this is possible is if idealism is true. And so it's actually kind of funny, because it flips the whole argument around on people who say that idealism is contrary to science and is anti-realist. Because it basically says the only way you can possibly have realism, scientific realism, is if idealism was true in the first place. And basically you have there's the phenomenon, which is your senses, and the noumenon, which Kant said is the world outside of your senses that your senses somehow correlate to. And he then just had a question of like, how do you get from one to the other? And he never really solved it. And then that was said how metaphysics was nuked at that point, and then everyone just like realized you can't solve this, and therefore there's no point in doing any metaphysics. And then people just went kind of positivist after that. However, there is a way to get across that, and you may not be able to know how you can get across it. However, you can know a precondition on getting across it, and that is if you have your phenomenon on one side, which is your senses, and the noumenon on the other side, which is objects, supposedly material objects, you have to have some logical explanation that starts from premises and reaches a conclusion to start with your senses and then conclude outside world. Okay, so and you think of a formal logical argument. At least you take in like formal logic in college, where they have, if A then B or not C, or P therefore Q, P then Q, P therefore Q, etc. That kind of thing. Well,
Right.
Use formal symbolic logic and set up an argument. Okay, and that argument can only have in its premises sense experiences of the outside world, as well as the things you may know, like minds, your mind exists, and so on. And then from that, you have to somehow derive the outside world, okay, but as a conclusion. Well, a very simple thing that is very obvious, so obvious that you actually kind of miss it when you do symbolic logic, is that, it's just intuitively obvious. If you have an argument that has premises with terms P, Q, and R in them, and you somehow get Y, X, and Z, or A, B, and C in the conclusion, you know that a non sequitur fallacy has been made. That you just, at some point in the argument, you just introduce that term, and for no reason, it just appears out of nowhere, and voila, that doesn't work. It's a fallacy. Well, and it's kind of a fundamental fallacy if you think about it. But anyway, so basically what that means is, if the premises are only purely mental, A, B, and C is only purely mental, the conclusion can only be purely mental as well, meaning whatever is in the noumenon has to have mental ontology, otherwise the two are not bridged. And so the whole thing flips around and says, if the outside world is material, you're stuck in a solipsistic delusion because you can never actually have access to it. Your senses are
Exactly.
their
Right.
own
Yeah.
thing.
Right. And when you say mental ontology, just for anyone who's not familiar with that term or wants more kind of precision, what would you exactly mean by a mental ontology?
Well, a mental ontology would be everything that is kind of subjective first person stuff. So like your mind, your the ideas in your mind, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not like something, as the analytics would put it, like paraphrasable down to just, some basic logical formula. It's kind of like you have to grasp the idea, but it's not fully reducible. Right.
In a way, it's number one, it can't be reducible because the thing is, you try and cut. Here's an example. At the bottom, you have the share screen button. It's green, right? Yeah. Well, you can cut green apart, right? You can say that's a combination of yellow and blue, but you can't cut yellow and blue apart, can you? You keep zooming in on yellow or blue, it just keeps, or red. It's more of the same, right? You can cut red in half enough times until it becomes non-red, right? Same with blue or yellow. And so because of that, it's fundamental. You can't reduce it to something else. And then the cool thing with the foundationalist argument is it basically says that all of our fundamental knowledge is of a mental category like that. And so basically, in order to have any knowledge at all, you have to derive it from fundamental, stuff that's intrinsically known, right? And the only things that are intrinsically known are mental. And then that whole thing is explained about how, you can only get like conclusions from like premises, terms and like premises, right? And so because of that, the only way to derive anything at all about anything is if the world is mental. It's false.
That's right.
Idealism is true and God exists.
You run into Hempel's dilemma there, where you never get a perfect physical explanation of the mental. You always have to appeal to the mental to explain the physical, but you can never appeal to the physical. It's just the Hempel's problem right there.
Mm-hmm. Do Kyle and Jacob want to pitch in anything here in the conversation?
No, not for that.
I do make a similar kind of point that Johanan makes about there has to be this sort of a continuity between what we perceive and then the external world in order for us to have access to the external world. So I'm sort of trying to come up with this principle that's similar to that called I call it like the principle of ontological continuity. and I want to apply that to perceptions. So I want to say that with the act of perception and its objects of perception, percepts, there has to be some sort of ontological continuity between those two. Because if there isn't, then there has to be something that accounts for the break between the two. And so I want to say that perception is a mental act, and then so that means perception would have mental ontology, and the ontological continuity principle would then say that the objects of our perceptions have mental ontology, and I want to say that the objects of our perception are objects in the external world. But if the objects in the external world have mental ontology, then that you can infer that the external world has mental ontology. And if that's true, then metaphysical idealism is true. That's something that I've been kind of working on. That's similar to what Johanan brought up.
Yeah, I think we're in a good place now just to move on then to Thomism, and then we'll get to idealism and quantum theory again. But I don't know which of the Thomists in the chat want to kind of introduce the traditional idea of how Thomism has been articulated.
Oh, the traditional Thomism?
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote a little bit down. I wrote, Thomism is basically a metaphysical model of reality based on Aristotle's categories. So it seeks to explain change through act potency, essence existence, substance accident. So they just say there's a real distinction between essence and existence at the existential level, such that we have God not only as prime ontological cause, but also as a sustaining cause, since a contingent concrete being cannot sustain its own change, nor can it ground its potencies, since it does not exist through its essence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then Thomas hold that God is metaphysically simple with no parts, which is a little bit different than the Scottist model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and John, are you closer to being a Scottist?
Yeah, because of the idealism, it's the idealism that I hold to, the Neo-Jungian transcendental existential Thomistic theism, because it's sort of an emanationist pseudo-Dionysian model, where the phusis is just modes of esse. So what we're doing is reaching out, and God is sustaining the modal theater, and he's like a phenomenological and an essential cause, because there's no matter. So my Thomism is sort of, I guess a radical departure from Thomism proper, because they say that the soul is the form for the matter, but I'm saying the soul mind has its own form and the body has its own form, and they just communicate through quantum entanglement. So there is no matter. It's just a phenomenological animated information matrix. So it's like a lucid, robust, abstract modal theater. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so the quantas of being, which are the N's, E-N-S, they're just composites of esse.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. So everything emanates from God. The essences, the esse that brings the essences together. The souls are sort of outside the body because they're in infinite, it's like they're in Hilbert space. So there's no distance there. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like infinite distance. So you can't really speak about distance. It's just a quantum entanglement, like Johanan was saying, that space-time emerges as an illusion from Hilbert space. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but yeah, basically that's it.
All right, Jacob, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was no, I think that was good.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, yeah, I mean, I think John pointed out, like, one of the important places that Thomism begins from, which is Aristotle, and then from there, like, the act potency distinction, which I think it's an important starting place. And I've noticed that for a lot of people who are into quantum theory, they kind of appreciate how, like, Aristotelian Thomists have noticed that, okay, yeah, they've been kind of saying from the beginning that reality can be divided into act and potency, where, like, act is like the truest, most immediate reality, while potency is kind of like this secondary reality that has to become actualized. But of course, I've noticed that Thomists, we tend to use, like, for instance, like we'll say that, let's see here, the substance is like the unifying principle, right, or something like that of the composite in question of form and matter, But then, I think people have been wanting more specificity out of the whole system, because we say principle, we say essay, right? But then people are like, what does that exactly mean? And it seems like
doesn't make sense.
Right. I think to John, and maybe I want to get Jacob's thoughts here too. Do you see idealism as giving us finally that specificity so that we can start shaking off some old ideas, but keep what was intact about the original system?
Well, you can keep some things intact, but you have to, I think, jettison the idea that God created matter from an act of his mind through a Cambridge change. But then matter is something in potency, and it's separate from God, and God's sustaining it. So it really doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that matter is sort of like a robust, abstract thing. Souls are more concrete because they're more in the likeness of God. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Can you explain that more?
Animating, like God is animating God. So matter basically from information theory, like it from bit. Archibald Wheeler came up with that idea that matter is not fundamental, that information is fundamental. So basically, information is, the definition of information on the Shannon theory is the removal of uncertainty. So we can say that God is actus purus, or perfect removal of uncertainty, or pure information. Do you know what I mean? So that's where you get, in a Scottist sense, a formal distinction in God. So creation is sort of a part of God, but it's all just pieces of God that we can speak of that are formally distinct, but they all speak to the same essence of God. You know what I mean? His creative act. But we can split the creative act from the modeless in-being of God by saying that there's a dual aspect monism. So God is apprehending himself, and through that self-apprehension, he's affecting infinite information in the modal theater. Does that make sense? And he's animating that matter. It's a phenomenological cause. So we add to the 5 causes, we take away the material cause, and we say there's a phenomenological cause. And then we add a virtual causation. So let's say if I want to go and play tennis or something and I hit a ball, I'm virtually causing the modal theater to move around, and God is syncing and sustaining that operation of me playing tennis. But I'm sort of playing tennis, but it's not as real as what people might think. My soul is the real thing, and it's entangled with the body, and it's experiencing that in the modal theater. So it's sort of like, I guess you have to think about it backwards from how Thomism is. Do you understand what I'm saying?
In what sense is it backward?
So I'm
again?
I'm virtually causing things to sort of interact with myself through the modal theater. It's what I'm saying is that God is concrete, souls are concrete, and the modal theater is just animated information through modes of essay.
So John, just a quick clarification. So are you saying that like consciousness is like the ultimate reality by which things happen, and then like
exactly what you guys are saying? Yeah.
Okay, and then this world is kind of like, I guess you can call it a dream or a simulation or whatever, right? Is that what you mean?
It's like God. If God is not thinking about himself, then the world would just not be. Do you know what I mean? But God's always thinking about himself through his mode of self-apprehension, because that's what God is, just constantly thinking himself, and he just spits out information in an endless stream. And so he's always creating worlds, and things are always going on. You know what I mean? But yeah, consciousness is fundamental. And like from Johanan said, he had me read that book about quantum hermeticism, that minds are fundamental. You know what I mean? So they're just entangled with the experience of the matrix, the lucid matrix. Yeah.
All right. So I think I'm going to give it back to the idealist to kind of just talk about the ideas that we've said so far, and, bring in the quantum theory, go wild with it. I'm really excited. So just, just to clarify, right? I think this part is more just defending the claims of idealism from the science at hand. and kind of maybe explaining it to the audience. I know we did that a little bit in the beginning, but I'd like to return to that so that we can start setting the stage for to get more specific on the details.
Well, so I guess if you wanted a very specific physics-based argument for idealism, I have a few philosophic ones, but the physics-based one. So you have what's called the holographic principle, okay? And if you want a little backdrop, a little more, explain this a little more fully so the audience knows where the whole thing came from. They had this thing where, the second law of thermodynamics is the most inviolate principle in physics, right? Or not the most, but second most, perhaps. It's entropy always increases, okay? And doesn't decrease. Well, so what happens if you were to throw something that was highly entropic into a black hole? Now, you'd think it would destroy the entropy, right? And that would violate the second law then, right? And this was a problem they were worrying about. And they were like, well, what happens here? Then some people are thinking that maybe it actually does violate the second law, that it just destroys information in a black hole. So they were working on this, and what they realized is there was actually a limit to how much, there was a very direct correlation between the event horizon size, which is the surface area of the black hole, and the information content you put into it. It's like a, very precise connection. And then there's also a question of, so how many questions, kind of go back and explain this a bit. Suppose you have like a room, okay? Like say John Konnor sitting on a sofa there or whatever, right? And you want to know all the information about that room. So you ask the questions about, well, the flower arrangements on the sofa, the color of the wall, little bumps on the wall, right? All that. And then, well, now you have all the information in the room. Well, not really, because you have to go down to a smaller level, right? Well, what about the atomic structures and so on, say in John's body or in the, the electrons moving through the power circuit. So you zoom in again and you ask all the questions about all those little things, and you have more information. And you keep doing this until you hit a point where then you start to, if you go down far enough, you run into the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Right.
Which says you focus on something with a location, you get the answer about the thing's location to high enough specificity, you're going to start to lose information about its velocity and vice versa. So let's say that we just want to focus on location. So which then correspond to, higher the velocity, the higher the energy, therefore. And so let's just pump the energy value up and focus farther and farther in and see how far we can go like that, right? So you have all this high energy measurements of the room, say a particle accelerator that's shooting stuff at close to the speed of light, that's having, pinging off all the little nuclei in the sofa and so on, getting all the exact information about all the subatomic particles in the room, okay? And you can keep going down like that as well, higher and higher energy particle accelerators, until you hit a point where the energy becomes so very high, and the room is of finite size that, and hopefully John will be out of the room by the time this happens, because we don't want him to get sucked into a black hole. But
Right.
At this point, the energy is increased so intensely that it turns the entire room into a black hole. And now you can't extract any information from the opposite side of an event horizon, obviously. And so then you have this kind of interesting thing of, well, that's all the information that you can possibly extract from the black hole, okay? From a region of space before it turns into a black hole. And so now if it happens to be that there is more information than we can extract from the room, that, beyond that point, then we're kind of screwed. We can never have a complete description of the room, no matter how hard we try, because it's always going to turn into a black hole every time we get there. Now, however, if it turns out that the amount of information content in the room is like a fundamental level, it happens to be equal to exactly how much we can measure, then we're in luck, okay? And remember beforehand when I said there was that relation between the entropy in a black hole and the surface area of the black hole? That it turns out that limit that is comes from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and general relativity on the amount of energy you can stick in a region of space before it turns into a black hole, it happens to be equal to that information content limit, which is called the Bekenstein bound.
Yeah, Bekenstein.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah, what that means though is that the surface, the information content of a black hole is exactly identical to what you can extract from the surface of a black hole. All before the place turns into, the instant it turns into an event horizon, you can get everything right up to that moment, and then you can get at that moment, you get the information content of the entire surface area of the black hole, okay? And so what was found about this was kind of weird. This is why they call it the holographic principle, was that you have information, the information content of a black hole is simply equal to, or actually directly proportional to its surface area. In fact, it's a quarter of its surface area times some like Boltzmann constant and some other things, right? And so, well, that sounds kind of strange because if you treat, let's say, a Christmas present the same way, right? That'd be like saying you could know what's inside the Christmas present simply by looking at the wrapping paper, right? And that's what the physics is saying the black hole is like. And so what's weird about that is that's basically the idea of a hologram, you know? You have a 3D, all the information in 3D space is encoded on this 2D horizon, right? And so they then realized, well, you know, this comes just from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and general relativity, quantum mechanics and GR, which is what we already know. And it's kind of the limiting case of, well, that's, you know, when you hit to the point where, you know, you come across the limit of both the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and general relativity, well, that's when quantum gravity physics starts to come into effect. And so now we don't have a full quantum gravity theory, but we do have, this is kind of useful because it gives us a limit on quantum gravity. And this says, well, this is what quantum gravity, this is going to have to be true as a constraint of quantum gravity because, you know, you're coming across both these principles and it's going to, whatever quantum gravity is going to be, it's going to have to be a limit of this thing. And so it's kind of reaching quantum gravity from the other side. It's drawing a circle around it and saying, here's where it has to be. And so we now also know that it's going to have to come in terms of information because we already showed you can get the full information content of an area from quantum mechanics and general relativity alone. So they then took this principle, the holographic principle, and they discovered this, you know, this applies in general, okay? This whole notion of describing a region of space by its specifically a three-dimensional space or four-dimensional space-time, but three-dimensional because you just treat the, you know, the time, just treat it as like a, you know, a physical thing in space for a moment, even though it has a temporal component. Three-dimensional space-time is equal to a two-dimensional quantum field, okay? And that's cool because before that, we didn't have any way to reconcile quantum mechanics and relativity. Now we do. We can say, well, one is a two-dimensional projection of the other, okay? So what they then did is we'll apply this in certain cases. You know, in physics, you have a physics law, like, say, Newtonian mechanics, and then you say, well, you can apply it in the case of orbits, or you can apply it in the case of bowling balls on the pool table and so on. Well, in this case, let's apply the holographic principle in terms of entangled black holes. Let's have two black holes, and let's entangle all the particles on their horizons, okay? So they're quantum entangled, that they have the same wave function, and so you obviously, I think everyone here is familiar with, Suan, you know what quantum entanglement is, right? The whole, you affect the one particle, it changes the other one instantly over there and so on.
I'm like roughly familiar with it, yeah, but not like deeply. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the basic concept, okay? So yeah, basically you measure the one state and then the other state is instantly correlated that on the opposite side, even though it didn't have that it didn't have that property beforehand. And so it's really spooky because it's you know,
right,
it's like magic basically. It's
that points to the fact that there's no space time really. That
yeah,
something's
exactly.
happening
beneath space time, exactly.
Right?
So now what's cool about this is, well, yeah, it points to that. But well, if you think about a worm, so what they found though is that these two entangled black holes, did you know what space-time metric they give back when you plug it into the holographic principle?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone want to say it?
Mm.
It's a wormhole, a Stargate.
Mm.
Okay, so you have or the Einstein-Rosen bridge on Thor, for example. It's a wormhole. So you have these two entangled black holes, and they are the two mouths of a wormhole. When you think about the concept of a wormhole, okay, what's being said here is that there are two regions of space that, despite the fact that they are very different, they're also the same, because it's the same point in space, even though it's 2 points in space. Let's say one's on Earth, the other one's on Mars, or something like that, right? And so there's this link, and what that means then is, well, you think about how space is defined in the first place. You know, in middle school, you're told to make a space. So you have a zero-dimensional space. You have a point. Well, how do you make a one-dimensional space, right? You have to draw another point. You have to draw a line between them, and that defines a one-dimensional space. And then another point off that line for a plane, and then off that plane for a three-dimensional space, a volume. and so on and so forth. And that's how space is defined, and that's how it's defined in physics as well, okay? Physics uses math and so on. It does everything with math. So now if you think about this, well, space is defined by the distance between two locations, okay? It's defined by locations. Without locations, there's no space. But here, what it's showing us is that that location is itself dependent on quantum entanglement. And so therefore, space is also dependent on quantum entanglement. And so then they came from that, they have that's the whole realization now in quantum gravity, where they're saying space comes from quantum entanglement. It's emergent from quantum entanglement. There's space is this, it's like that's inside the matrix. Quantum entanglement is all the links of programming that are happening outside of it, okay? And it's all information at that point, because it's not, matter requires space to exist, as Kant pointed out. This is all information. They're actually describing physics in terms of information now. That's the whole bit from bit digital physics, quantum information view of things.
Mm-hmm.
That's, so a lot of physicists just kind of ignore that and treat things instrumentally. But when you get to quantum gravity or quantum information theory, the quantum foundations is kind of unavoidable, and people are just kind of shifting that direction now.
So I'm wondering, can someone talk about, like, where do minds come into this case?
Okay, well, that's the first half of this.
Okay,
that's
cool.
the first half of this. We've just described the physics, okay? The material, so-called material, we've all broken it down to information now, entangled quantum information. Well, now let's go over to cognitive science, okay? And let's look at, I know Hoffman doesn't like this, even though it replicates stuff in his own model anyway, including like some of the really basic stuff. However, integrated information theory. Now let's suppose that, for sake of argument, that Kyle is a dualist and Suan, you're a materialist, and John is a neutral monist or something like this. We're all having this complete disagreement about consciousness, right? I mean, you could even go like Aaron Ra was debating the soul with some guy the other day, right? Like it's like a Buddhist or a Hindu or something like this, and they had this debate about the soul on his channel, right? And soul exists, no, it doesn't exist, etc. Like neuroscience truly says, and like, no, you're not bringing in these philosophic arguments. Like, okay, forget all that. We all disagree about that stuff. However, the one thing that everyone should agree with, even if they're materialist, a dualist, a neutral monist, idealist, whatever, is what it is like to have consciousness, okay? And so Tononi, what he did, he said, let's forget about that ontological disagreement for a moment. Let's simply describe consciousness as we because that is consciousness fundamentally, right? It's just, if consciousness is outside of our perception of it, it's not consciousness anymore, is it? We're not conscious of it, therefore it's not our consciousness. And so if you think about it, consciousness is simply information that we see, like say on the screen or in our senses, we're sitting somewhere or lying somewhere, etc. We can feel that, we can hear the sounds. All those things are bits of information, mental bits of information, right? And they're integrated together into a single experience, right? So I don't have your thoughts, Suan, or Kyle, or John, or whatever, or Jacob, but I have mine, and so on, right? So it's information integrated together into a single system, and that's what consciousness is from a simple, purely phenomenological point of view, okay? Then he said, let's put that phenomenology and put math to that, and he comes up with this formula, and then he shows, and this is actually in his paper on this, that is like a footnote in his paper, that entanglement qualifies as integrated information because the two states cannot be treated separately from each other, right? And if you think about this, the binding problem in consciousness studies, for example, there's apparently black and white lines behind you, Suan, right? And well, there's a shape, a geometric shape, and then there is a color quality associated, black or white, right? And you can't have the blackness without the geometric shape, and you can't have the geometric shape without the blackness, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe on a more basic, a different level. This would be another example I used in a recent video, or excuse earlier this year video. This is a different type of binding, but it still counts as binding. I say the word zebra. What comes to mind?
The number, right? Yeah.
Right. And even if you go to the zoo and you see a zebra, you don't just see a black and white striped horse. You instantly comes to mind that the letters ZEBRA come to mind, right? Those two things, they're associated in such a way that there's like this instant like connection between them, and there's no way you can't dissociate them, right?
Right.
Just come together as part of a single conscious experience. I mean, assuming you've grown up with the English language and are familiar with what a zebra is and the English language and so on, And these things are just, they come as an automatic connected unit. And that's, well, the binding problem, right? Well, the only thing that actually fits that mathematically is quantum entanglement, because it's not even a materialistic equivalent to that, say a computer, can link the two terms, but fundamentally it's still broken down to these little mechanical parts that are not, that are separate from each other, right? That one has to access the other one. It's part of this code, and the code has to program bit by bit through a computer. And then you have this link, but it's not a perfect link. Whereas with this, it's an instantaneous, you're just aware in your consciousness that these two things are inextricably linked from each other, right? So what he's getting at here is entanglement equals consciousness, and you can get the same thing from Hoffman's model of conscious realism. Entanglement equals consciousness. Again, he actually had a derivation of this, where he showed the free particle wave function that would entangle objects is equal to quantum, is equal to consciousness, conscious experience. And then you can go about this from a third approach too, which is completely experimental, which is quantum cognition. And I love doing this particular example. I've learned a number of, including some famous people's favorite ice creams this way. Suan, what is your favorite ice cream?
Chocolate.
What is your second favorite ice cream?
Probably vanilla.
Okay, so you go to the freezer door, and well, you want to go for the chocolate, but then you're like, well, do I really want the chocolate, or do I want the vanilla, right? And now, if you've seen the Terminator, where any one of the Terminators are, you see them from Terminator vision, and they're forced to make some kind of choice. They're automatically programming. They have readout printouts of like this choice, and then it immediately like processes through each one very rapidly, and then it selects one, and that's it, right? And the decision is made. You see the decision being made in real time, in like an instant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And robotically, and it says, something, or picks its new weapon or something, right? And you think about it, well, when you go to the freezer door and pick the ice cream, you don't really do that, though, do you? You kind of sit there and you like waffle for a bit, right? And so you don't model very well like a Terminator, right? And so you think about that, well, that's, people have been trying to do that. In neuroscience, they've been trying to say, this just is classical computation, and we're going to figure this out with neuroscience, and we're going to have the connectome, which is all, it's nice to have a connectome there to figure stuff out. But then they're trying to treat the connectome as this classical thing that has, is processing bits like the Terminator, right? Like your brain is a big AI, essentially. And it's just processing like that. Well, no, it's not. It's processing it in a completely different way. And you have first-person experience of that because you don't ever process the vanilla and the chocolate that way, right? You waffle, and then all of a sudden you kind of make up a choice, and you're like, it just kind of collapses to one or the other then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, does this sound like anything you know of elsewhere in physics?
Right, superposition of eigenstates, right?
Yeah, that's Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat dead or alive, and it kind of waffles between being dead or alive until it's one or the other, right? And so you have this kind of a, well, you might say, well, that's just a coincidental. You're drawing an analogy. It's not really anything more than a metaphor. Well, not really, because the reason this was first discovered in a robust way was people were discovering, oddly enough, that stock market behavior was obeying the Schrodinger equation. They could model the behavior of the stock market with the Schrodinger equation. And that sounds totally, quantum mechanics and economics, how could you have two more dissociated things, right? And then they realized, well, what is a stock market in the first place? Well, it's constituted of a bunch of individual, buyers and sellers on the stock floor making choices on whether to buy or sell, right? So, and you think about, this is not really an economics thing, it's a human decision-making thing applied to economics, right? Because that's how all economics only boils down to human decisions to buy or sell. And so they then realized, well, wait a minute, let's treat this as, this is human cognitive sciences, and they actually did studies on this, and they've shown now that indecision and just human decision-making in general, human in thought processing, models like with the Schrodinger equation. And there's this whole field called quantum cognition now, where they are actually modeling, and it's kind of funny to see this in academia, because not all, but like a lot of the people who are saying this are saying, oh, no, it's not really how this, it's not really quantum mechanical. It just behaves exactly like it's quantum mechanical, with the exact same math, and like, sure. That's convenient. It's kind of obvious why they're doing that. It's the whole
Right.
there is interest. You know, academia is a sociological framework, and sociology has its certain problems. If everyone decides that the emperor is wearing clothes, and the emperor is wearing beautiful clothes, whether he is or not, right? So anyway, what was kind of cool though is there was more recently a guy named Matthew Fisher came along, and he found that there's a study actually. He proposed this experiment, and then he discovered that it was actually done in the year I was born. I think it was the year I was born or the year before. It's either 84 or 83, and it was on rats. Okay, and they did this really cool study on feeding rats lithium isotopes. Okay, either lithium-6 or lithium-7, and the only difference is a single neutron. And if you've taken your basic chemistry, you know that a single neutron is not going to change the chemical properties of an atom at all, because those are all determined by the valence electrons and how the charges in between the protons and electrons, the different, atoms interact, right? And the only thing that changes here is the mass, right? And so there shouldn't be any change at all, right? It's just this little neutron extra. What's going to be the difference, right? Well, they discovered when they gave, as you know, lithium is a psychotropic compound. They use it, it's sometimes prescribed for depression and so on. And what they did was they had these studies on the maternal instincts of rats. And it was found that the ones that had, I think the lithium-7 or the lithium-6 were really going crazy. They were, either lithium-6 or lithium-7, I forget which was which, but one group of rats behaved very sluggishly. They were very neglectful towards their kids, cannibalizing the infants and so on, and terrible nest building skills. The other group was not just building nests and like keeping care of their offspring and so on. They were doing it on a ridiculous level. Fisher even said in his talk they were acting like the helicopter rats. The kids, those were the safe pups, he says, because the kids, the parents were always looking. They were going berserk looking after the kids, right? And there was this very marked cognitive difference in the two rat groups. And well, how can this be? Because it's just a single neutron atom or neutron in the atom, which is it's not going to change the chemical properties or the chemical properties in the brain at all. The only thing that changes is the mass. Well, you look about mass for a second. Well, he looks in and he discovers, the mass. What that changes is the Schrödinger equation. The Schrödinger equation, the only thing that's dependent on is the Hamiltonian, which is the mass and the energy total. And so it then gives back, it shows up in the K value of the wave function, the vibration frequency, which is, and we'll get into the hermetics business in a bit later, but it changes the vibration state of the wave function of the atom. And so whatever the cognitive behavior of the rats that was being changed by the quantum property of the atom and nothing to do with any chemical properties. That was the only property that was any different. And so what's really fascinating here is we have a direct experimental evidence now of cognitive behavior in rats, and actually because rats don't have a fundamentally different nervous system than humans or any other mammals, or actually any other animals for that matter. It's the same basic, they have differences in neurology and so on, but it's the same basic cells at work in rats as it is humans, as it is octopi and dogs and giraffes and what have you. But what was really fascinating about this is they then showed, this is the first experimental evidence of something quantum mechanical changing consciousness in the brain. And they then further did a study, and this was the whole thing for years. I mean, they would cite this Tegmark study, which was only critiquing one version of Hameroff and Penrose's model, right? And it was then said, well, therefore, it doesn't work, and it wasn't even the version that Hameroff and Penrose were putting forward at the time. And everyone keeps going back to the study. It's really irritating because it's 2001. It's ancient by now, and it's been shown that it only applies to this model and nothing else. And they're saying, well, the coherence times for the atoms are too small, or the quantum mechanics is predicting are too small for it to possibly affect what's happening with the neurons at a much different time scale, okay, and much different size, right? And this is like a really old, stupid critique. I keep hearing it, not so much anymore, but for a while it was just coming up over and over again. It was like, can we please move past this stupid red herring, people? Since then, they've discovered, quantum computing drives photosynthesis. There's quantum smell, where again, a single difference in isotope will change the smell, how you smell something. It apparently drives bird migration and so on. And now it is affecting the cognitive behaviors of rats, okay? So they've actually been showing now over and over again that there is actually, contrary to what people were saying 20 years ago, that the quantum activity actually occurs in biological systems at the kind of scales that you be expecting for this, if it were to affect consciousness anyway. So this is not really a problem anymore. And then just to put the icing on the cake of that, he then says, he furthermore computed the time of like the lithium isotopes, the coherence time in the brain. And it was like, there was a certain way it was shielded because it was like part of a molecule. Actually, he thinks now that the actual computation itself in humans is not in the lithium. That's something that affects the system, but it's in something called the Posner molecule, which has like phosphate ions, which it thinks are the entangled states. And because they're part of this larger molecule, it actually affects how they're kind of shielded, because they go with this kind of molecular complex that goes with them and kind of shields the ion itself. And he actually discovered that the coherence time is like 15 minutes or something like this. And it's like, whoa, that's the same time as like, short-term memory, right? That's well within the range that we need to have computations in the brain. That can go on, computation in the brain is like, like an eighth of a second or something like that, right? And well, this is way past that. And so that the whole thing that you can't have quantum activity in the brain has been completely blown out of the water now. So that was the experimental evidence. So now you go back, basically what you're saying is consciousness equals quantum entanglement. Space-time emerges from quantum entanglement. Well, what's the conclusion? Space-time emerges from consciousness. And if you want to get really fancy with it, you can go a step further. And I saw you were talking about the Wheeler-DeWitt equation in the chat there, John. You have the, entanglement is by definition when two or more particles share the same wave function, okay, quantum wave function. Well, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which they've actually done a test of now, it has the unique property of being timeless, which is outside. Right. It could therefore study, and that was why we're connected to the act potency distinction. Remember?
Yeah, I said that the universal wave function is prime matter in Thomism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, so here's the thing, though. Not just that. This is the cool part. So they've actually shown now that if time emerges from, they showed that time emerges from entanglement as well. Right. And the only way time can emerge from entanglement is if there is a universal wave function, because universal wave function is uniquely the only wave function that exists outside of time. Time bubble just collapses. It's literally like a timeless object, which is really kind of cool. It's like kind of the sort of Star Trek thing where there's like, remember Deep Space Nine when they had those wormhole gods? Mm. And the prophets, the Bajoran's prophets, and they existed outside of space-time, outside of time, and it's like that. It uniquely has that state, okay? Well, and so they've shown time emerges from entanglement, therefore a universal wave function does exist, and a universal wave function, by definition, is shared by everything in the universe, okay? Or, at least it goes beyond the universe because it's outside of it, right? But everything is connected by it, right? So right. Everything is entangled by a single universal wave function, okay? Well, if you have a single universal wave function entangling everything, so you can equate, entanglement with a wave function with entanglement and entanglement with consciousness, well, we got a single mind simulating the entire universe now, don't we? What is that?
Exactly, and it's omnipotent too, right?
It's omnipotent too, because, well, by definition, it would have to be, because
it's all right. It's coding the lower boundary, right? So that's just,
you're omnipotent with the thoughts in your own mind, so it's going to have to be thoughts in its own mind, and well, by definition, it contains everything else in the universe. So it's omniscient by definition, because it is the kind of cool thing about this. I realize is that idealism, God's omniscience of things is the same things as the things in themselves.
Right. Well, that's undermining my Jungian digital Thomism. Then God has omnisubjectivity too, because he's animating what your experience is. So God sort of knows what it's like to ride a bike, because he's sort of giving you that experience phenomenologically that you're experiencing in your mind. And the qualia of that experience is just the interaction of the Turing numbers. You know what I mean? Like the code.
Yeah.
The quanta is the code, and the relation between the code and the numbers in the natural numbers is the qualia. And I think Bruno Marchal, he has a couple of papers on that. So if anybody wants to check out him, he's really good for that. But back to you.
Yeah, let me just kind of also kind of narrow down on some topics that I'm interested in. So, I mean, one of the things that I want to talk about is just why would we want to put Thomism and idealism together, right? So maybe John or Jacob can talk about that, but what distinctively, like what do we want to take from Thomism and put in idealism that maybe sometimes, you know, idealism doesn't maybe fully articulate or take into consideration, and what needs to be changed in Thomism? I know, John, you've already talked about this a little bit, but it'd be really nice if we could talk about why we want this marriage to happen.
I had two ideas on this. I'm asking John, but I have two ideas. I know Kyle has a third idea on this that I'm not familiar with because I'm not too familiar with Thomism, but Kyle was with this, and he's this particular aspect. He was talking about relational causation. I'll let John speak first, and I can explain the two things that I was able to connect out of quantum idealism and Thomism, actually. So
sure. So we'll have John go first, and then Johan and Kyle, if he wants to come in.
Yeah. Well, if God is pure act or tantum esse, then God is metaphysically simple, right? Thomas ascribed to that. So what Thomas Aquinas says in his Summa, that God's act of self-knowing is a mental act, because he's not in composition with any matter, right? So, I mean, right there, that points to like a reductive idealism, you know what I mean? Because it's just God's mind. That's how you'd want to pick up with push Thomas on the idealism aspect. And if you take that aspect, that God is just self-apprehending and he's affecting information, and you take what Johanan said about the information universe, I mean, you don't really have to say too much more, right? If you can code a volume by the Bekenstein bound anywhere in the universe, and God is, you know, an active information sort of mainframe, then you have Thomistic idealism right there pretty much. You just have to sort of get rid of that matter kind of potency, matters and potency, but you can just use existential Thomism and say it's essay that's animating the physicists. You know what I mean? The other Thomist here, does he have something to say?
Yeah, Jacob, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, I like the point that John just came up. John just said where, you know, if God is pure act, right? He's a mind. It's a mental act, right? That's something that I bring up too. So in relation to that, there's this from what I remember, there's this, you know, Aristotelian principle that, you know, potency is grounded in act in some sense, or, you know, possibility is grounded in what is actual in some sense. And so I want to look at prime matter and you know, prime matter and pure potency and how that relates to pure act, and then how we can describe that in idealistic terms. So similar to John, I want to say, like, you know, prime matter as pure potency is grounded in God, because potencies are grounded in the, you know, what's actual, and God is pure act. Then, you know, if God is a mind, then, you know, God's pure act is some sort of mental act, and so prime matter is grounded in and actualized by a mental act. And since all things would be fundamentally grounded in God as pure act, then all things would be grounded in some kind of mental act, right? So I say here that if God as pure act entails that mind is pure act in some sense, then like maybe like could we say prime matter is like every potential activity of mind? Possibly there are some sort of relations between when people talk about the unmoved mover, God as the unmoved mover, some people relate that to us and how we have free will. We're like mini unmoved movers in a sense. And so I'm thinking, well, if there's the analogy between God as unmoved mover and us as unmoved mover, maybe there's an analogy between him as pure act and us as like a mini pure act, whereas you know, he his mental act actualizes matter as potency. Maybe there is some sort of connection we can make with us where you know, objects have phenomenal properties, but they have them in potency, and then our conscious observation kind of actualizes them, almost like an Aristotelian version of what Berkeley kind of says. And so yeah, I guess I mentioned earlier, I guess my main motivations for sort of marrying Thomism and idealism is because it's very selfish. I'm Catholic, and so I kind of want to, but I like idealism, right? And I want to, I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too a little bit. But I do kind of just want to get to the truth of things, and just that's kind of more foundational to it as well.
Well, Jake, if I can interject too, like, I've been thinking about how, in our conception of God, right? God is the supreme reality. Everything emanates from him. And then as John has pointed out, like, God is, let's say, the prime animator of everything in some sense, and the sustaining cause. So I thought about, like, okay, so if God is intellect, so basically in divine simplicity, God is identical to all of his attributes, right? They all collapse into basically the same reality. So then if you think about omnipotence, omniscience, all these other attributes, and then God's intellect and will, like, even though you can kind of differentiate between them, right, they all have to collapse into the same one reality in some sense.
Right.
So I already see, like, from the beginning then, like, okay, we shouldn't expect this radical division between mind and matter in the first place. There should be a stronger connection just based on a very conception of God from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think there's an important distinction to be made that we're talking about matter, because when idealists talk about matter, like when contemporary idealists talk about matter, they're talking about contemporary physicalist notions of matter, which is very, very different from Aristotelian notions.
Yeah.
Because Aristotelian notions are basically it's just kind of potency, the substrate of potency. And physicalist or physicalist conceptions of matter are that matter is a Cartesian substance that it's res extensa. It's just purely quantitative, and then it has its own independent existence. But Aristotelian matter, it's not a Cartesian substance. It's not an independent existent. A matter can only be actual from something priorly actual. That's the whole that whole kind of argument from change, what's prior, only something potential can only be actualized by a prior actualizer. And so that what that actualizer fundamentally is, that it's a mental act. But yes, like matter is very different in Aristotelianism. That's why I think it's compatible with idealism.
Yeah, and before I get to Kyle and Johan real quick, for me, basically, I came into metaphysics through ethics. So, like, my main specialty is like Thomistic ethics and those sorts of issues. And then I touched teleology.
I think there's similarities too there.
Yeah. So I'm interested in, like, how would we frame final causes and an efficient causality and so forth within an idealistic framework? Would we still have quote unquote Thomistic teleology, or how would it have to be modified?
I think this was related to Kyle's idea, actually.
Oh, sure.
Right. So I think that there could be. I generally hold to the four types: efficient, final, formal, and material. I think those are all still compatible with an idealistic metaphysics. But maybe we should move on to Johanan or Kyle.
Sure. Okay. Well, I said Johan and then Kyle, so let's go to Johan then Kyle.
Okay, so I'll let Kyle do the efficient causes thing, because he has it connected to teleology with the whole kind of segue into the Hermetics thing, because that actually ties into their principle of cause and effect. However, with me, I had two particular things that I thought could be unifying some aspects of Thomism with idealism. Now, when I went across Thomism, I didn't study it as a system, okay? I did philosophy, but Thomism didn't come up as much in philosophy, especially in my minor. It did come up a little bit in Biola, but it came up like hardly at all in my minor when I was doing philosophy in undergrad. But when I first ran across Thomism, it was being used as kind of a counter to my idealism, and I was kind of annoyed by it, and I suppose disliking it first for kind of selfish reasons. Like, well, actually not totally selfish, because it was also, I wanted to, I could explain so much with my idealism. And you could then shut down the whole atheist argument of, trying to hide behind science permanently to get away from, I just brought God into science and said, haha, I can derive God from science now. And I saw this as kind of annoying. I'm like, come on, guys, what is this? Why are you being so, like, you're treating this as like a dogma? Like, you're not supposed to do philosophy as a dogma. Like, why are you doing this like a dogma, number one? And why are you so like obtuse about this and trying to interject this? And so kind of, at first it came across slightly antagonistic about it, right? But then I discovered little pieces. I actually learned about the detail. I didn't know it was connected to Thomism at the time, but the whole idea of hylomorphism and Holland-Merism from JP at Biola and JP Moreland, obviously. And I then discovered that you can actually, this is the first of the two things, I discovered that despite the fact that it was being presented in a way that it was like a contrary system to my quantum idealism, I was discovering, well, actually, no, it's not. Or not completely. I mean, they were saying, okay, it has this little direct realism thing, but I showed that, you know, you can't have scientific realism without idealism anyway. It's not, that might be the one thing that's wrong about it is the direct realism. But I mean, that's kind of been shown to be wrong outside of the idealism anyway. That's just, you know, kind of the consensus among the philosophers as well as both the physicists and the cognitive scientists now is that it's some kind of indirect realism, right? This is how we've learned about how the world works. However, putting that issue aside, the other pieces of it though, just kind of starting from like a kind of a piecemeal empirical quote unquote approach to it, right? Noticing there's these little pieces of Thomism and they fit with my idealism. And one example is hylomorphism and Holland-Merism. And well, with this, they have this whole notion there's this body, right? And the body is connected to a soul, and they're linked in such a way that like the soul is like all throughout the body in a way, right? And it's
right. The body is Merrick and the soul is Holland.
Yes. And so the soul has this Holland-Merism property where it's Holland-Merism, and this is going to sound really familiar in a moment. Holland-Merism is this idea that the whole is contained in all the parts, right? And each one of the parts has a little bit is defined by the same state that defines the whole. Well, what does that sound like?
Entanglement.
Entanglement. That sounds like entanglement. That just sounds like it. That is entanglement. It's all the particles defined by the same wave function. And that wave function, everything is the same system. You can't treat them as.
That's why I said that's how you explain Thomistic participation, essence, existence, participation. The essay is in the essence through entanglement. That's the only way that you can explain. Otherwise, you have a mystery in Thomism, and I don't think people want to swallow that mystery. So
I've noticed that. Someone was insisting Holland-Merism or hylomorphism was the
quantum mechanics vindicates Thomism in that sense, but I don't know. I'm on the Thomist group, and I'm in there giving comments sometimes, and they're wondering what the hell I'm talking about half the time. But
I noticed that they present.
I like to hear what you're saying. It's good.
Yeah, they like to present this as though it's like contrary. Like one guy was actually saying, "Well, no, it's." I was giving this explanation for the interaction problem. I said, "Well, there is no interaction problem because it's all mind, right?" It's just, you know, because you simply misconceive what the body is. And they're like, no, you forgot about hylomorphism. And then because you haven't been doing your philosophy, Johanan, and he's going like this whole, and he seemed like so dogmatic about this. And because in my mind, at face value, the notion of Holland-Merism seems very counterintuitive. And he was insisting, it was common sense. Like, no, it's not common sense to me. I mean, if I take a biology textbook, I see the body is made of little cells. The cells are made of atoms. And, you know, it behaves like, you know, the atoms are little interacting parts of charge, right?
Right.
This is a clockwork universe in a way of Isaac Newton, and it's all interacting. Where do you get this from? It's like the view out of nowhere, and it's that's because the Enlightenment screwed up what everyone thought of as common sense. Like, what? And then but then I said, well, no, actually, you can get, you know, I flipped it on and said, no, the only way you can make sense of hylomorphism is. And I used a philosophic version of it, but I said, you know, if idealism is true, then the property of binding is fundamental to the universe. And then binding would then explain, you know, why the bodies are, basically what it was, so there's this soul body distinction, right? I noticed hylomorphic dualism is not dualism in the ontological sense.
No, not the ontological.
Absolutely, that's something I've noticed as well.
Yeah, it's not
Cartesian. They treat it as though it's they treat it as though it's like Cartesian dualism in a certain way, but then they like to go back and say, no, it's not like it. It's different than it. Descartes was wrong, but why are you treating these two things as substances? What it is a a substance form dualism, not a substance dualism. And so, well, so the substance is this property, this thing that has holomorphic, holomeric properties to it, where it's quantum entanglement. Everything's, that's the property of binding, where all the pieces are linked to each other in a way that they can't be disconnected from each other. And now, what about the form? That's the body, right? The soul, the body is like an aspect of, is like a projection of the soul in a sense, I think, or not projection, but it encodes that, like it's the material coding of that.
The soul is the form of the body, essentially.
Well, let's put that into idealism for a second.
It's the soul is the information, if you want to frame it. It's the soul is the information that codes the body. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to get to. Well, let's look at it specifically with quantum gravity. Well, quantum gravity says
exactly
space-time geometries emerge from quantum entanglement. Well, if quantum entanglement is the soul, and you have these space-time geometries emerging from it, well, some of those are the geometric forms of Johanan, Raatz, Suan, Sonna, Alander, John Konnor, Jacob Power, etc. Right? Those are your geometric structures there, right? And so what this is doing is it's saying there's a soul, and that's what it looks like behind the matrix. And then when that information processes into the matrix, into the virtual reality or the perceptual interface, it manifests in the form of these geometric body plans that we see.
Right.
And there's your holomorphic dualism.
Right, and then you use Shannon entropy bits to explain your modal theater, like your degrees of freedom would be sort of like all your modal abilities. So you can still hold to an essential Thomism thing and just frame it in information theory. Like what you're doing, it makes way more sense than framing it the old way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm having a lot of fun with this.
And the one other idea that I had that was connecting with Thomism was kind of cool, the act potency distinction. Well, God is pure act, and God is outside of time, right? He can't change. He can't be other than what he is, because he just is this simple thing that is always. He's like almost like frozen in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, but potency stuff is moving around, and so on, right? And so that was this. I also got confused by the language Thomas were using. Like, what do you mean pure act? Isn't act something that moves around, and potency something that stays still?
Yeah, it's like a metaphysical thing. He's like the omnipotent ground. So he's all active potency. So basically, God can affect infinite degrees of freedom. You know what I mean? In the information theory, like his information Shannon entropy is infinite degrees of freedom, whereas a fair coin toss would have two fair coin tosses would have 4 outcomes, which would have like 2 bits of Shannon entropy if you plug it into the equation. But God's creative act would just be infinite entropy bits. So like God can do anything. He can think with his mind, besides doing contradictions, like
conceive of anything. Yeah. Well, you can't completely conceive of a contradiction, but yeah. So it's kind of funny, because that was actually one of the other things that kind of annoyed me about it at first, was the weird way they were using the language. But so it's been kind of like a love-hate relationship with Thomism, moving now towards love over time, because I've been noticing it was all in the way people were presenting it to me, as being like, no, you're wrong, and you're being like super dogmatic about, like, well, no, I'm right, and I'm right because this part of your philosophy is right. They're the same.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on. You're right on you hit the nail on the head with the quantum idealism. So I mean, hopefully a lot more people will switch over to it, because if you study the physics and you read about, like, get a book from Leonard Susskind on the holographic universe and read it, and you just add that, read a book on quantum mechanics, and then you can read a little bit on Thomism, and I mean, you should have it, like read Diente, and you can marry all those models together and you get quantum idealism for sure.
Yeah. Well, anyway, back with the act potency. Well, so look at the physics of it, right? So God is like kind of frozen outside time. He doesn't change. And then potency is stuff, everything in time, moving around, etc., right? Well, that just sounds like something we discussed a little bit earlier, doesn't it? What was the only one wave function that was outside of time?
Right.
Universal wave function. It's the ground.
Yeah. Right.
It's the the one thing outside time, and all the other wave functions have a time component to them. And
Right.
so there's God and the stuff in the universe. And so it's kind of cool because it's literally the act equals God equals universal wave function, potency equals stuff in the universe equals all the individual wave functions in time. And it's right there.
Yeah, I think John mentioned in the chat sort of equating the universal wave function with prime matter, and I think that's an interesting equation.
Yeah, that actually ties back to the whole Hermetic thing. I read a different book. It wasn't on Hermeticism per se, but it was after I saw the book on the quantum Hermetic, I was kind of curious about this. It was Real Magic by Dean Radin. He does all of his, he has a whole bunch of tests that he had done as well as other people had done in like laboratory settings of psi, and he was like showing it like way past 5 sigma and so on. But anyway, he got a little bit into the theory behind it, and they were talking about like they actually brought up Hermeticism, and they said, well, there's like this one thing, which was like, and it would sound like translate the physics terms is like there's the quantum field, and then there's I forget what the other thing was. It was some other aspect to describing it, and it was like basically the same thing described as like a mind or something behind the reality. And so like, the field of it looks as though it's not actually, the field is not the mind itself. It's just that's the way it projects in the universe. And it's
Right.
cool because it brought
Yeah.
the notion of prime substance, prime matter.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at with the Meinongian Thomism is that God is apprehending himself, and then it's a projection of information is his act of, but it comes out of Hilbert space, which is the universal wave function there. And because we have a universal wave function, that also works with the theistic modal actualism, because when you have a universal wave function, you have an Everett view of it. It's like a many branching worlds. So that's how you get time from the decoherence of the branches. You know what I mean? We're experiencing the branches, and then through decoherence, we experience time. But time really doesn't exist. It's just an experience of decoherence, and it just, as you say, comes out of Hilbert space. So.
Yep.
All right, so I want to pass the mic over to Kyle, just if he wants to talk about causation. And then after Kyle talks, we'll get into time, because that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. So just God's relationship to time and everything. So Kyle, take it away.
So when it comes to like teleology, right? So you have these 4 causes. You have material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and a final cause, right? So I think in my mind, I see it like this. So there's a principle in Hermeticism. It's called the principle of cause and effect. Now, some people say, oh, well, that's just efficient cause, right? Well, when you actually look at it, it's not, when you mean by cause and effect in Hermeticism, it's not just about the physical universe. What it's talking about is literally all planes of reality. So we're talking about the Hilbert space itself, kind of causing effects within physical space-time. Now you'd be like, well, how is that relevant, right? Well, if you look at final causation, I mean, the reason why there is final causation, or telos in nature, is because there's these ideal forms, right? So like human beings have an ideal form that they have to follow, and if they follow that ideal form, then that's kind of like their nature, right? Wouldn't you guys call it, I just want clarification, wouldn't you guys call it like a form or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it's called? Okay, I just want to make sure. So
Well,
basically,
in Thomism, it would be an ens. It would be an essay with an actus essendi or something like that. It have its essential nature. So all the modal attributes would be connected to that form. So you would be flourishing if you were experiencing your modal attributes. But
right.
You wouldn't
now,
be flourishing.
The one issue, I guess one objection to Thomism that I see is like they'll say, oh, well, we don't have any justification to actually believe in some sort of like essence because there is no form out there, so to speak. So like, well,
under the information universe, it's all coded.
Well, you're right, and that's what I was gonna get to. So basically,
that points to Shannon information theory. You have a sender, you have a code, you have a receiver. You have bits of entropy, degrees of freedom. It just makes sense.
And the thing with cause and effect is because it's about the different planes, then what you have is you literally have like we can call it the spiritual plane, but in scientific terms that would just be Hilbert space. So you can talk about that in terms of essence, right? And then there's another concept. It's called there's these things called archetypes, and this is like a more Jungian notion of archetypes. And I was thinking that those archetypes kind of represent the ideal form or the ideal like essence of something, and then everything kind of reflects off those archetypes. So basically, archetypes is a different way of talking about like something's essence or something like that. So that's another
right.
So in
you're talking
Thomism,
about type tokens, yeah.
real fast, in Thomism, just to clarify, because I'm not that familiar with this area. So they're saying like forms are somehow behind cause, like
right. So basically, like there's an ideal form, basically. So like there's an ideal form of like humans. There's an ideal form of like
divine
animals.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's funny is when you connect that to like archetypes, right? When you go to the quantum hermeticism, you can kind of see these archetypes behind physical space time, and those archetypes are basically the ideal forms of reality, basically.
That is very fascinating because I never heard you completely explain this before. But okay, so with Hermeticism, the idea here is they call this is the second principle, the principle of correspondence. And it basically, you might have heard on like kind of the quote spiritually or New Agey side, the phrases "as within, so without," or "as above, so below," right?
Yeah.
Well,
they're both connected, right? So even
they're the same
the
thing.
principle of correspondence is kind of like a way to connect the two, right? And then the principle of cause and effect is basically explaining the telos of how it all happens.
Yeah. So now what's interesting about that is, remember in the Quantum Hermetica, I think it was as part B of the third chapter, about correspondence. Yeah. Actually, what they're talking about there is very specifically Jungian stuff. Okay. So what they mean by the within world, I mean, it's also your within, your inner space, but it's a shared inner space. Everything in God's mind is a shared inner space with respect to us, but it's not conscious. We're not omniscient the way God is, and so we don't have access to all that. Because of that, all that comes across to us as a subconscious, and because we all share it, a collective subconscious. Well, now we're in the area of Carl Jung, okay? Now, if you recall with Carl Jung, he had this whole thing with dream studies, and this is kind of crass. I'll use kind of scientific language to make it less crass, but I bring it up because it was a historically very famous example of Jungian archetypes at work, okay? Carl Jung had a mental patient, okay? Not, just a guy off the street, and he was in an asylum, I think. And he was quite certain this guy was not an academic or a scholar or any of this. He just, crazy guy off the street. And he had a dream about God's phallus hanging from the sun and spraying the earth below and giving life to the earth, right? Now, this passed around in his psychology circles. All his fellow doctors were, psychologists were talking about this, and it was horribly politically incorrect, and everyone thought this was hilarious. And this story just kept passing around for a couple months, right? Now, at face value, you just think, well, this guy has a really whacked out imagination, right? Well, about half a year later, 6 months later, there was an archaeological discovery. And well, not just they had already found it, but they had finally someone had translated it. Some translators had come across like a 2,500-year-old ancient Mithraic text, okay? And in that text, they describe a divine phallus hanging from the sun, spraying the earth below, and thereby giving life to the earth. Now, this is a completely obscure thing that wasn't even published at the time of the guy having this dream, right? And yet there it shows up in the dream.
It's the same, basically the same thing.
Same thing, and Jung was very certain that this guy had never seen this before. I mean, it wasn't published yet, and even number two, even if, it was out there, but it hadn't been translated yet, right? It was basically someone's, museum piece that they were, someone's private little laboratory where they were, copying the symbols down and making a translation and so on very meticulously. And there's no way this patient from the psych ward would ever have had access to this, right? And so yet somehow he picks this up in this dream, right? Isn't that the weirdest thing ever?
That's pretty crazy.
That is pretty crazy. And this actually, it turns out this is one example of this. This is something that's happened multiple times. I've actually had several dreams of this nature myself, which are kind of cool. I was doing research for a science fiction novel that I was trying to kind of merge with some fantasy aspects. And so I did some research into fantasy topics, such as, in this case, it was giants, for example, right? And okay, so let me begin by saying, I had a dream some years back where I was outside of London, and it's kind of weird because before last year, I've never been outside of North American continent. And this is like, years and years ago, like when I had this dream, like 10 years ago, easily, 15 years ago, something like that. Anyway, in the dream, I was outside London, and there were a pair of 14-foot tall giants, okay, called Gog and Magog, right? And they're twins, and they were farmers outside of, and I was like watching a TV about how they had discovered some kind of genetic atavism that had been dormant for like 14,000 years in the humans. It appeared last in the Pleistocene epoch or something, and how this had reappeared in London. And I was out there, and I was seeing these guys in real life, and it manifested in the form of these giants that were just showing up. It comes like before the flood kind of stuff. Anyway, and it's just totally weird dream comes out of nowhere, right? And you're probably going to be thinking to yourself, well, when you heard the words Gog and Magog, you're probably thinking Revelation, right?
Yeah.
Probably got that from Revelation, you think, Suan?
Yeah.
It's kind of mingled.
Right.
A whole bunch of elements got, what? Yeah.
It's a poem by Allen Ginsberg as well, but it's in Revelation too, yeah.
Yeah,
Gog
okay. That's what you would think, and that's what I would think. Okay, that's what I thought for many years until I did research on my novel, and I discovered there's a little known, before the Romans invaded Britain, there were stories about them there being giants that were supposedly inhabiting Britain, okay? This is why supposedly where stone comes from, and it was like there were Roman generals that were defeating giants and so on. It's like a little thing that like kind of goes on in folklore, and it was, thousands of years ago, this was supposed to be the case. And some pieces of that folklore continued on at a very local setting, and, this is like, for example, in one case they gave was London, okay? And they talk about, and this is going to totally blow your minds, there was a pair of twin giants that were 14 feet tall that lived in London, whose names were Gog and Magog. Supposedly, according to the folklore, this is like their local, local folklore, and it was, you would never discover it if you hadn't like lived in London or unless you were doing research into comparative mythology topics. I'm looking at this and I'm like, it isn't to say they were real or anything. It's just to say that as an archetype, I had this dream.
Subconscious, right?
What?
Yeah. It was in the collective subconscious.
It was the same thing. I'm like, but where did this come from? It's like, I dreamt about this and I didn't have any access to this. It was just like, and so whether it was real or it was just archetypal, there was an archetype there of giants named Gog and Magog, who are 14 feet tall, are twins and live in London. Well, I had the same thing in a dream. And so apparently whatever the source of that legend was, it's the idea is that it's tapping the same collective unconscious. And so, by the way, that collective unconscious, this is the cool part, that's, if you think about that in physics terms with the quantum cognition thing, that's just equal to the Hilbert space all of the wave functions exist in, right? And
I think
stuff's happening outside space.
I think the collective subconscious also explains the phenomena of scopesthesia. When you feel like somebody's watching you, kind of thing.
It might. Well,
have you heard that scopesthesia before?
I haven't heard that term before, but yeah. Well, actually, that makes sense. Actually, I think I think this was brought up in Real Magic. Actually, they had they've actually done studies on this where it actually it's a thing. So. Get to that scopesthesia, I mean, that actually is like a subconscious version of clairvoyance, essentially. Someone else is in the room even though you don't see them, right? You don't really know it, you just kind of sense it, and you're not really certain. Well, yeah, that explains that, and explains a wide variety of so-called parapsychological phenomenon, if it were real, right? Because you have this, your mind. Okay, so this is the cool thing. Here's a way to think about this. Is going to kind of blow your mind because it's so intuitively obvious. When you think of stuff existing outside of space-time and quantum gravity, it sounds like Star Trek, does it not? Like some wacky science.
It does, but it is science, actually. If you read a book by Tuscan, it is science now. It's
I know.
They're moving away from the old science, and now everything is just information physics, basically, because information physics can describe everything. So.
Right, but what I'm saying is, I'm trying to say as a the kind of vibe you get when you hear about this physics, even though it's all actual physics, you hear it. It very much has a Star Trek-y, science fiction-y vibe of this is all this wacky, like crazy outside. There's a captain. There's a hole in the space-time continuum right in the front of the ship, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like that kind of stuff, right? It's just like this is not the realm of common sense. This is the realm of this weird science fiction out there metaphysical possibilities.
Right.
Now, put it on its head, okay? Because that's your first vibe. I'm going to show you that weird out there science fiction metaphysical possibility thing is actually something that's a lot more common sense than you actually realized. And this is when you see how it's common sense, it gets really spooky, actually. It kind of shifts your consciousness on how you think about this. Okay, so remember I said there's the wave function, the entanglement exists outside of space-time, right? And that explains the scopisthesia effect that John was pointing out. So we would define that as Hilbert space, right? Well, if you go to quantum cognition, what is that? What are those quantum states in that wave function outside space-time? Those are your mental states, right? And you think, well, that sounds even more science fiction because now it's like these weird mental states. I mean, now we're talking about the continuum, right?
Because actually, Alexander Proust has a traveling quantum forms interpretation. So where the minds are following the body, and I think a lot of philosophers believe that mind is supervening on quantum states. So I don't think it's crazy. Yeah.
No, but now the really easy way to make this not crazy all of a sudden, and you realize, no, this is not just some kind of weird thing that is like a when you hear about the mind existing outside space, I mean, it has kind of like this spooky quantum woo kind of vibe to it, right? Even though it's not actual science, but it has that.
It's not kind of quantum woo. Like there's a lot of interpretations that are.
I know.
Using that.
I know.
And
but what I'm saying is
that kills physicalism. That kills reductive physicalism because if they say that everything reduces to the physical, then you cannot adequately explain reductive physicalism because if minds are existing outside of space, right?
Yeah.
So
okay. So now,
real quick. I want Johan to just get through his thought and wrap it up, right? And then we can move on to some of the other questions real quick. But Johan, finish your thought.
Okay.
So the thing with this is that there is actually something very commonsensical. Think of the number 2, Suan, right? Now, if I were to open your brain up, do brain surgery, open brain surgery on you, I couldn't find the number 2 in there, could I, right? Now, if I were to simultaneously ask you, well, where is the number 2? Is it in your car? Did you leave it under your bed? You'd say those are nonsense questions, right? I mean, and obviously why? Because it's not something that exists spatially, right? But then you say, well, it exists, right? Well, duh, it exists. And then some people will say it doesn't really, well, actually, no, it has an ontology because you're thinking about it as a,
right. You can speak, it's a problem of intentionality. Like something exists, you can't say that's a non-existent object in Jungianism. It has to refer to something. So it has a thin layer of existence, Yeah.
So, well, that's a Platonic existence. It's a Platonic form of 2 that you're accessing temporarily, right? And of course, Plato pointed out the forms are outside of space-time, aren't they? Well, and that's why they're outside space-time, because I already pointed out that I tried to find your brain doing neurosurgery and I couldn't do it. And I tried to look under your bed for the number 2 and your car for it. I couldn't find it there either. It's outside space-time. Well, isn't that kind of funny that the physics that's describing the mental state of the number 2
it's outside space-time.
Right? Well, I think that the outside of space-time of the Platonic forms is actually the same outside space-time of quantum gravity. You think talking about them in 2 different contexts, one of them sounds like, well, that's obvious. Everyone knows abstract objects are outside space-time. Another one is like, Captain, there's a hole in the space-time continuum right in front of the ship, right? Well, those 2 things are the same thing. And so this outside space-time thing, we're actually very familiar with it. We're familiar with it every waking moment of our day when we think about anything at all. And we don't even realize it. And it's kind of crazy because people, they don't think like that. And the one has this crazy science fiction Star Trek feel. The other one has maybe if then you add the layer of mind on it, it has like this kind of weird mystic quantum woo feel to it. But the third one is just, well, that's just common sense. That's just how the world is, because that's our day-to-day life that we're aware of.
Yeah, let me, I want to ask John a question, and this will move us on to our next question, but I want to make a quick comment. Like, for a lot of people who have been kind of fed kind of basic physicalism or a kind of a naive materialism, it almost feels as if like, all the stuff that we've talked about would seem really crazy and radical to them, but it seems as if, right, like we're gradually learning that the materialism and physicalism that we've been implicitly taught is just not allowing us to think beyond its boundaries. It's kind of a trap, like a prison almost in some ways. So, I mean,
yeah, we'll never progress really if you just keep thinking of in a physicalist frame of mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So, John,
quantum mechanics has been resolved for 100 years, or almost. It's forced it into a materialist framework, and it's like, no, it's not materialist. Sorry.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
So, John, I wanted to ask you, so now moving on to the question of time, right? So I know that, usually Aristotelian Thomists like the A theory of time, although like I've heard some suggestions that Aristotle seems to be a little bit of both A theory and B theory. I know that Proust is a B theorist, right? And then I think Kyle mentioned he's a C theorist, so that might be fun to talk about. And also, by the way, what did you say, John?
That's quite interesting, a C theorist, right? I've came across it, but I haven't really read too much on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I'll have Kyle talk about C theory in a bit, but John.
Yeah, let him talk about that. That'd be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, so, from your perspective, right, typically speaking, we would conceive of change or motion as the actualization of an object's potential by an already actual actualizer. And, Phaser points out that this fits really nicely in kind of an A theory perspective. But people have said, well, if you're a Thomist, you have to be you have to be an A theorist. You can't escape that framework. But Proust and other people like that, they've been thinking outside the box. So how would you conceive of change, and especially that particular causal principle, in a Thomistic idealist light? So what theory of?
Oh, you would just.
Yeah.
I'm in the B theory camp, and I'm just thinking in an Everett branching world. So that's how you'd experience change, through decoherence in time. And you can just say that change is sort of like the realization of all the potential eigenstates. Do you understand what I'm saying? So change is sort of like a potency is brought into act in that sense from the quantum world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And like some people would, I've heard some people say, well, like, look, if time isn't real and if time isn't real and you're just subjectively experiencing succession, then that means the change can't be real either. So in what sense would change be real?
Well, it would be real in the sense that things are, from entanglement, things are emerging into space-time. So we would have a phenomenological sort of experience of it. So it would be real in that sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because when we say, like, maybe even subjective is the wrong word to use in terms of B theory. I don't know. It's phenomenologically, right, we experience the change and then it gets translated into, like, all the language of entanglement and so forth that you brought up. But it's not, I don't know how to put it exactly, but it's not as like how the A theorist will conceive of it as being this totally mind independent material kind of reality, or?
Yeah, because the A theorists, I think they reject the temporal part idea. They just think that you're moving through time as all your parts together through time, and time is not really quantized like that. Time is not. It's almost like a gonky object. Do you know what I mean? It's not quantized in bits and pieces. It's sort of it's an experience that emerges from entanglement. It's not real. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, the last part. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a lot of problems with presentism, and I actually think eternalism is more an intuitive position for a Thomist, even though, like, Thomists will say A theory, but I think eternalism is more intuitive for Thomism.
Yeah, and Jacob, I actually want to get your thoughts on this too.
Is because Well, I was just going to say, even Aquinas mentions God knows all at once. He doesn't know by discursion, right? So that would just point to a standing block universe, sort of like what Johanan was saying. It's a code in a mainframe that once we're entangled with it, then we experience it, but it was already there. God already realized all the active potencies, and we're sort of at our birth, we're entangled with the matrix. But basically, ontologically speaking, time doesn't exist. It's just a function of you can do quantum mechanics without time. Do you know what I mean? It's just an illusory experience.
Yeah. And I remember too, you know, when Rob Kuhn's on Capturing Christianity, he talked about like how A theory is actually really hard to reconcile with God's omniscience, but then B theory seems to be the more intuitive position with respect to.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah. So Jacob, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just a couple things. John mentioned atheists and their conception of time as, you know, they don't like temporal parts. So you're just this present whole that moves through time. But I think there's a problem there because on presentism, only the present moment exists. So if only the present moment exists, there is nothing to move through. There is only ever the present moment. So to me, that actually makes it less less intuitive in terms of change, because there's really only the present moment. Whereas on eternalism, there is the past, present, and future, and there is a movement through time, which to me captures that intuition better. And just
it's not really scientific, because if you accept the universe of the model of the holographic principle that everything's already coded on the lower boundary, then A theory wouldn't jive with that at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I kind of see. This might be way off track, but I kind of see similarities when we look at. This is way off my kind of specialization, but like energy in the universe. Usually, it's like you know, the total energy of the universe is zero, right? Because it's positive and negative energy kind of combined into, you know, the net energy of the universe is zero. And so that doesn't mean there isn't any energy at all. There's still energy within the universe, but as a whole, it's zero. And that's kind of how I think about it with time, is where there's this sort of ruler of time. Time is there's this eternalist version of time where everything is just kind of static, but then there's change within the static things, and sort of so like the universe as a whole has net zero energy, but then there's still energy within it moving throughout it. You know, I think if we think of God as pure act, I think it's really hard to avoid eternalism, because creation is obviously an act, right? And if God is pure act, he never moves from a point of not acting to acting. He's always acting, right? He's always in act. So if we're going to say creation is an act, then we're going to say that he didn't move from a state of not creating to creating. So creation is going to be sort of tacked on there, like an eternalist, tenselessly tacked on. But that doesn't imply that he had to create, because that's temporal, not modal.
Yeah, well, that's why God's self-apprehension, he's always creating, you know what I mean? So we can't say that he just came to a point where he decided to create.
Right.
We, in a way, every creation is contingent on God, because it wouldn't exist if God didn't think about himself. But creation didn't come into being at a certain point in time. Yeah. It's kind of, I guess it's hard to reconcile, and the way our mind works, like it always existed under different modes of existence, but just now it's under esse naturale and esse phenomenal. So we can experience creation, but God has always been creating worlds, and there's other worlds that are not accessible. If you study System K or Kripke logic, you'll understand that there's non-accessible worlds, and the way that they frame worlds in the modal logic. So you'll see that there's different worlds that are existing right now, and they're equally as actual in God's mind as this world. This world just seems like the only actual world, but there's other actual worlds realized in God's mind. You know what I mean? So that's, I think it's counterintuitive, and people are thinking that they're the only world that exists, and God made this world as the actual.
That's MWI, or maybe not MWI per se, but like maybe the many minds interpretation, the idealist version of MWI.
Yeah. So like
Which I realized a while back.
Yeah, affecting
It's basically Tegmark plus divine conceptualism gives you MWI.
Yeah, infinite active potencies are already realized in God, and then when we're born, we're just sort of entangled with the matrix, and until our timeline. So we're like a long worm with temporal parts, basically.
Yeah.
But our body is not, because we have a wrong conception of our body. Our body is sort of just information, a robust, abstract information passing through the matrix. Our soul is the real thing that's important. Like, we have counterparts in other worlds, but those counterparts aren't entangled. That's why this world seems like the actual world to us. It's where
we only have access to this one. It's indexable.
Yeah, because we have access to them. We don't have access to all the other worlds. But that's where the theistic personalists, I think, fail in their model of God. They think this is the only world God is making. This is the only world I exist in. But P-zombies are possible from Chalmers. So I have a P-zombie in another world. And this is actually a lot of mystics have realized, like, God showed them what would have happened if they made this choice. They'd be suffering in hell, or if they'd made this choice, they'd be doing this now. So God is sort of revealed in certain divine revelations that a lot of this physics is true. You know what I mean? Like the many worlds, the Everett, decoherence, everything, it does tie to what you were saying, Johan, about the occultism. Yeah.
So before I get to Kyle, before I get to Kyle on C theory, I just also wanted to ask, like, suppose someone is concerned, like, oh, well, this sounds like determinism. If we're just like, if everything's just coded already, right? And what would free will look like on this picture?
It wouldn't be.
I have a way.
Sorry. Yeah.
Of dealing with this topic, because everyone assumes, and before I was a C theory, well, C theory is basically simply the philosophy way of saying emergent space-time, it seems. But the B theory would be basically general relativity, right? The block universe. And I'd always been B theorist before learning, B theory, I suppose, would be a limiting case of C theory in some sense then. But I'd always been a B theorist simply because, I before I even knew about this whole A versus B thing, I've been reading physics books ever since I was like 13. And I'm like, what are you guys arguing about? I thought this had already been settled by Einstein. They're like, no, William Lang has pointed out that it's compatible. A neo-Lorentzian, you mean a pseudoscience model, is compatible with the A theory of time. Like, yeah, it requires two extra premises, and one of them is generally not accepted by physicists, and the other one is also not accepted by physicists, and it's also has serious philosophic coherency problems, which is absolute space. And so I'm listening to this, and they're very stubborn about this. But anyway, so they were bringing this up, and they're like, well, what about free will? And they were always trying to hammer me, like, you don't believe in free will. Like, no, that's not true at all. And there was a class I took at by Ella, and we talked. It was on divine conceptualism, divine foreknowledge and free will, right? And I was trying to, my paper, my final paper for the class was a way to reconcile this. And there was one of the papers discussed in the class. I forget the name of the three guys, but there were three guys. It's a famous paradox in free will and divine foreknowledge literature, as well as, for that matter, atheists who have like a hypothetical version of God, right? It's still, there's still a true statement about what this would be, and there could be a hypothetical being knowing that true statement. So it's still an interesting paradox for them. But anyway, the idea was you have one guy with a mind control implant and a second guy, okay? And the second guy wants to kill a third guy, right? And the first guy also wants to kill the third guy, right? However, the thing with this, I think it was like Bob and I forget who the other two guys are, but anyway, Bob either kills John or whoever, or Thomas, whoever it was, or does not, right? And but then let's say that he doesn't kill him with his free will, okay? At the last second, the other guy, let's call him John or whoever, not John Konnor, but someone else. I forget. I think it was John, Bob, and someone else. I forget who else. I don't know if those are the right names. I think Bob is one of the right names, though, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, the first guy if the second guy decides not to kill the third guy of his own free will, the first guy will then activate the mind control implant in the second guy to make him kill the third guy without his free will. And so the question is well, where is the choice made, right? Is it, right up to what point is it made? And, because you have, well, if it's the last second, can you tell who is morally responsible for killing the third guy, right? Because what if they choose at the same time? One of the guys afraid uses the mind control implant, and the guy chooses the right way, or wrong way to kill the third guy. And so now are they both culpable, or is neither one culpable? Because kind of over causation as to who killed the third guy, right? Mm-hmm. So now we have this little paradox, and so what I was focusing on with this was where exactly does the free choice happen, right? And so the point being made was that the second guy could pull out at the last second, right? He could say, well, I was going to kill him, but I'm not going to kill him now, right? And so, well, where is his free choice happening? Because when you think of free choice, think of, could have done otherwise, right? Well, you realize the could have done and the otherwise are kind of separated from each other in time, and they're not part of the same action in a sense. When you think about, well, the free choice was not done a day before the shooting. It wasn't done an hour before the shooting, because at those points you still could pull off, couldn't you? You haven't done it yet. You could choose otherwise. And so it wasn't even done an instant before the shooting. It had to be done the instant of the shooting. Because if it was done an instant before, well, then it wasn't a free choice anymore. Then it was simply a cause and effect bowling, a pool ball mechanical relation between the previous instant and the next instant. So if it ever was done at a previous time, if the choice was ever made at a previous time, then it wasn't a free choice anymore, because then it was simply cause and effect to lead to that conclusion. So the conclusion with this is that the free choice has to be made simultaneously with the action, okay? Well, then you think, when is an action? It's done in an instant of time.
Entanglement.
Well, not just, I'm thinking more simply, it's done in an instant of time, one single moment of time. And then look at a block universe. Well, a block universe, everything's laid out like a film strip, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's all laid out like a film strip. Then you might say, well, no one has any free will, because all the events in the movie have already been played out. It's gonna end up the exact same way that we saw it happen a million times over, and no one has any free will. They're all pre-fated to just keep doing this for all eternity, right? Well, not really. Yes, it's all frozen in time, except what you're not realizing is each of those free choices is a freeze frame in that time. It's happening it's you are making your choices, but you're doing it in eternal now, in a sense, from like the B theory or C theory outside time sense. B theory says there is no flow of time. C theory says time itself is kind of, even the block is kind of a construction. But
Kyle, could you kind of unpack more what C theory is?
Yeah. So C theory is actually the position that McTaggart held. And the reason why is because he actually saw problems with both A and B theory. So his problem with A theory was, his arguments are really complex, so I'm not going to get into it, but basically what he thought is like neither A theory nor B theory was like a complete explanation of time, and his idea was called C theory. Basically what C theory says, it's very similar to B theory. So like it does accept that like time ultimately, like there is no present moment or something like that, but what he says is that there's no direction of time. So basically like the flow of time is basically just a purely subjective phenomena. So basically there is no objective like arrow of time. So even on the B theory, like even though on B theory like everything is tenseless, you still have like a direction of time. You still have like past, present, and future. Right. But on C theory, you don't have that. You don't have a direction of time. Everything's just kind of like emergent, or I guess the best way. So there's a movie. It's called what is it called? It's called Arrival. And basically, the idea is that time is basically dependent on your language. And so time is essentially just a completely subjective phenomena. And the reason why we experience time the way we do is because of our consciousness, or maybe our language of talking about past, present, or future. So basically, under C theory, there is no real past, present, or future. It's just kind of like points on a graph or something like that. So yeah.
John, what are your thoughts on that?
Just a second. I got low battery here.
Yeah. Yeah, just on how Kyle articulated C theory, and I know that you're a B theorist, so maybe do you have any like quick questions or clarifications that you're interested in, or even Jacob if you want to come in and ask some questions.
Yeah, let Jacob, because I really don't have any questions on the theory of time there. I'm more committed to the physicists say that it's a block universe. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And we experience time through decoherence. So basically, God has already pre-made every choice that we can make, but we're entangled in our choices. So we're just following the modal choices that we can follow on our timeline. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, a few worries, I guess, I have about C theory as opposed to B theory. As Kyle said, they are pretty similar. But the whole arrow of time thing. So like that, the arrow of time, the movement from past to future, from past, present, to future is very intuitive, and so I kind of want to keep that. And if I remember correctly, physicist Seth Lloyd, he explains the arrow of time by appealing to entropy, because entropy it only goes one direction in a sense, because it's always increasing, right? I believe. So he wants to explain the arrow of time as sort of correlative with entropy, and so I think that's an interesting explanation. And so like
that's the only way physicists have to explain time, like as you know which way.
Yeah, they use entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. You're right. You can also use information entropy too, but I think the decoherence one works well with God being omnipotent, because he's already achieved every active potency he can achieve, and we're just going through decoherence and experiencing time in that way.
Well, decoherence always is associated with an increase in information. So
yeah.
And then I guess another concern I have about C theory is it's more of a semantic concern, I suppose, because at least with presentism you have before and after, and with eternalism you have earlier than and later than. But with C theory, since there is no direction, how would we really distinguish between any sort of points? At least with presentism and eternalism, we can distinguish between different points, whereas C theory doesn't seem to have that. So I feel like it would be difficult to even. I
think the best way to describe this, and this kind of gets into the whole, it's kind of interesting, because it gets into what Kyle was getting at about the final causes being caused by forms and all that, is that yes, it doesn't have before and after, or earlier than, or later than on the timeline, but it still gives you back a like it's an illusion of a before then or later than, right? Like there's a construction there that is so much like in a video game you have a fake space, right? You know the space in the video game is not real, right?
Right.
Well, it's like having a film strip that is like a fake film strip. So yes, there's a big construction of this deeper reality, and there is no time out there, but there still is this construction of a film strip, just the way there is a construction of space in a video game.
Yeah, and I also want to keep in mind that like I'm not, this position I'm still thinking about, so I don't actually officially like hold the position. I just think it's a good like alternative to kind of to B theory, because I do think that B theory, I think my issue with it is I think the block itself is a construction, right? So really even the block like itself is kind of emergent from something deeper. So yeah.
Yeah, well, at least C theory, just in and of itself, hasn't really, from what I've seen, hasn't had much exposure.
Right.
So
that's the other problem, right? I mean, many philosophers haven't really explored it, just as many philosophers
I didn't hear about it till this year.
Yeah. So I mean,
just like idealism doesn't have a lot of exposure either. I definitely would like to,
just like idealism hasn't had a lot of exposure. I mean, C theory hasn't had a lot of exposure either. So.
All right. So I want to. Okay.
Really fast, I want to interject with the thing with Kyle, because it gets back to the whole cause and effect thing in the with either B theory or A theory, you have a normal notion of cause and effect, right? There's events preceding the next and so on. Well, he's getting into the whole Hermetic principle of cause and effect, and we tied that into the Jungian collective unconscious, which is really that's very closely connected with the principle of correspondence in Hermetics, because it's that is the inner world that the outer world emerges from, and so on. And if you study Carl Jung, you find, well, he's known for the collective unconscious. Remember that spooky thing where there's a guy having a dream that shows up in a Mithraic text, a couple months later, right? And he had a lot of examples of this. He had because he did dream analysis, and he studied this over and over again of these archetypes showing up in everyone's dreams, even though they were from all over the world and they had no connection to each other. This wasn't, by itself, that's really spooky, except that it wasn't to him anymore, not because it still wasn't spooky. It was because it kept showing up over and over again. It's like, there is another one, this is happening over and over again all the time. Anyway, there's this notion of synchronicity where you have, stuff that you've heard of spook. You probably have had them in real life, even the term signs from God, right? In the Bible and so on. Well, like Gideon's fleece, right? I'm sure there was a nice cause and effect relationship between why the fleece was wet or not wet and so on, right? And if you were to look at it each time, you'd be like, okay, well, it definitely is this is why there were drier conditions that night or what have you, or et cetera, right? And you look at it like that, you're like, well, there's nothing spooky about that at all. That just is how it is. But then you discover that it works every single time. It's kind of creepy because on the one side, it has a completely quote unquote physical explanation if you look at it in a naive sense. And yet somehow these very normal cause and effect actions that seem completely material always kept happening such that they end up with these spooky coincidences occurring, right? And sometimes to get, I've heard stories of them that really, really spooky. Like there was this one guy who was in a certain restaurant eating a certain pie, and then he noticed another guy in the restaurant who he had seen there years ago when he was eating the same pie at the restaurant. And he's like, hey, isn't this weird? I happen to be sitting here, I'm with you, and I'm eating this pie. And we're like, the guy's like, I remember that is so weird. He said, the only thing missing now is this other guy who happened to be with us at the time, right? And that would be crazy. What are the odds though? He that would never happen because he's not going to walk in the door because, it's just too improbable, right? Out of the blue, the third guy who happened to be with them that day walks in the restaurant door at that same moment. They're talking about that. And it's like, this does actually had happened. And it was like, what are the odds of that happening? It's just, it's too freakish. And this is a phenomenon that's happened, many cases. And so with this thing, there is this, what's driving that there? That's not regular cause and effect. You could say it's regular cause and effect. The one guy happened to want to go there, but at some deeper level, you can see there's a pattern there that you can't explain it with just pure probability, And so the idea is that there is some kind of archetype of those three guys at the restaurant and one of them eating a certain kind of pie, right?
Well, that gets back to what I said. God has realized all the active potencies are all the experiences, and we're just sort of plugged in.
Yeah, and so so what it is it's playing out this archetype that is, even though, they're separated by 10 years of time, in a way they're not really separated at all because it's the same archetype appearing. It's like a single archetype that's kind of eternally happening. It just kind of goes up again, even though it's 10 years later. In a certain manner of speaking, it's still the same time as it was 10 years before when they all three were there. They're sharing that same archetype all over again.
All right, so I'm gonna move on real quick because of time, and I just want to get to one last question. So the last question is, what are the ramifications of Thomistic idealism for theism? Right. So, I think the most important question that everyone has on their mind is, okay, does this favor classical theism or theistic personalism? So, John?
Well, classical theism for sure. But you have to modify it it would have to be a Scottist univocity of being, where we're limited information and God is unlimited information. So God is like the Cantorian absolute infinite, and we're limited by our modal character. Do you know what I mean? By our quanta of being. We're limited by modes. God is modeless, meaning he has all the modes or all the modules of information. Do you get what I'm saying? So he's not contingent on a mode. So I wrote up some equations here, but I think it's a little bit too late. Maybe you can get it off me from another time. But I wrote off some conceptual relation, formal relation, indistinct relation. If we can frame our relations, then we can see that in a formal relation, the information coming out of God is it all refers to God, but it's existentially robust, and it's a little, we can think about, let's say, God's justice and God's anger as sort of two sides of the same coin kind of thing. So there is simplicity in God without composition, because what I'm saying is the creative act, the animated modal theater, is sort of like what Johanan was saying. It's like tapes already made, and we're just sort of experience them as they go, but they're not moving in time, and they're not like how would they say, it's not something that's in composition with God. It just is God, and we're experiencing God's creative act. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm a very big proponent of classical theism, and I personally, I definitely kind of want to reject the Scotist formal distinction. I want to say, I don't want to say that the God's omniscience and God's omnipotence and his properties, those are really distinct things, because to me that seems to imply some sort of composition. But right at the end there, you just said that if he is his omniscience and he is his omnipotence, if he is metaphysically simple and that entails that, then I don't think we could have a formal distinction. But I don't think that a hybrid of Thomism and idealism would require there to be formal distinctions, because I think we could have like a Thomistic classical theism or Thomistic divine simplicity, because I'm very sympathetic to Neoplatonism and Plotinus. My avatar I usually use is Plotinus, and so Thomism is influenced by Plotinus and Neoplatonic writings, like like Proclus and Porphyry and stuff. And,
right.
And Plotinus's system is generally considered to be like the first proper system of idealism in Western philosophy. And Plotinus is very much in the camp of like a Thomistic divine simplicity, where he just kind of is just this absolutely simple thing. So if we consider Neoplatonism as a kind of idealism, then it's perfectly compatible with Thomas's understanding of divine simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I just took some Duns Scotus and some identity relations, and I said if something is identical for X and Y, if they're actually identical, if and only if it is logically impossible that X exists without Y, and this is a symmetrical relation. So we say a formal distinction would be X and Y are formally distinct if X and Y satisfy the inseparable relation, and the ratio of X does not include the ratio of Y, and this is under symmetry. So we would say that we can think about God. So God would have formal distinction in God's creative act, such that the distinctions seen in God are not mind dependent, but are existentially robust, and also are of the ratio of the thing itself. Such as in God, the information or the resolution of uncertainty, or the modules, refer to God's act, yet are distinct in that these modes of existence refer to the same unified simplicity of God's in-being, or God's act of self-apprehension. I don't know if do you get what I'm saying there? So that would be like a Scotus distinction. So all the modes, all the information emanating from God, it's like code that's all distinct, but it all sort of renders the divine ideas.
Yeah, that sounds more close to Thomas's conception of the simplicity than the Scotist conception that I'm familiar with. Maybe I just have a bad understanding of the Scotist interpretation of simplicity.
I sort of tried to syncretize the two a little bit, but that's basically what I was getting at. Yeah, it's because of the information theory. Because God is just information, basically, because he's totally intelligible. So he's pure resolved uncertainty, where we have uncertainty in our being. So that's the difference. We can sort of render the difference between us and God through entropy. Do you get what I'm saying? I guess you'd have to study a little bit of communication theory to get that, but that's sort of where I'm driving at.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Does anyone want to add anything? I think this is maybe a good place to wrap up.
Yeah, so I'm a neoclassical theist, but I think if you were to take this form of idealism, this kind of new form, then yeah, I think it would work better with classical theism. So Yeah, that's all I gotta
I'm
say.
so glad to hear you say that, Kyle.
Yep.
Well, yeah.
Nice.
Well, here's the thing: is like for example, I accept divine simplicity, but I have like a modified perspective on it. So like, I do agree that like all of God's attributes are ultimately like grounded in one attribute, that sort of thing.
Right.
But I still
Right.
think there are conceptual distinctions between his attributes. So,
Well, there can be a conceptual distinction, but I mean, in God, basically, I see under like the Mainyangian digital Thomism that God's creative act is an attribute. So it's sort of like a necessary
Right.
part of God. Yeah. So that's how I'm seeing simplicity, as there's necessary parts of God. And basically it all renders down to information, which was Johanan was talking about. So God is simple in that sense. He's just infinite information.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, maybe, okay, one last question, I promise, and then I think we'll be done. So, I mean, I could imagine someone like Ryan Mullins, jumping onto the last thing that you said there and saying, well, doesn't that make, lead to modal collapse, right? Because if creation is necessary, right, then you reduce all the modality, like you reduce modality or whatever, eliminate
Well, it would be a certain type of modal collapse that you would just say that it's an essential character of God, that God is the creator. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, okay.
And then it would be sort of like be a fake a paradox of the stone or something. There's a stone that's so heavy that God can't lift it or something like that. But it wouldn't be a modal collapse because God is able to affect infinite active potencies. So he can make infinite worlds. He's not stuck making one world over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm getting at, the infinite information, and creation is an attribute of God. So it wouldn't lead to that type of modal collapse that they're into, that they're saying that God's stuck making the same possible world over and over again or something like that. But he's necessarily the creator. He can't create because creation is part of his being. But all of his creations are active potencies, and it's just infinite worlds, and our world is just actual to us.
So basically, all the worlds are necessary, but they're all, put it, of course, there's semantics of what the word creation means, because we often associate our limited atheoretic intuitions about time with creation. But a better way to describe it is like, you can think of like in a Neoplatonic sense, there's the one up top, the top form, aka God, and then that emanates all these other forms eternally, but they're all substituted on God. And so so yes, they're not created in that sense, but they're still created in the sense that they all are, their origin stems from God. God is their
they're necessarily contingent, right? And
necessarily contingent.
They possibly could not be, in a sense. So they're counterfactually possibly could not be, but they do necessarily exist as God's creative act, because God is the creator of necessity. God is the creator because that's one of his attributes.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I guess I can look into that.
Well, it contains all, I mean, it's the whole divine conceptualism plus Tegmark. If all the ideas in Tegmark's are inside of a mind, there's your mind. And you could even take it further of equating a mind with an idea, then God is the top idea, aka the top form,
Yeah, I'll try to look into making an argument to block that type of modal collapse charge, but I don't think it's there, because it's sort of like I said, it just, the modal collapse doesn't exist because God is the creator. So you can't say that he possibly cannot create, because he necessarily is the creator. You know what I mean? Yeah. So you're sort of begging the question kind of thing.
All right, so I'm gonna stop the episode here. I mean, we've talked about so much, and what's really fascinating is that, throughout this conversation, like, so I told you that I began from ethics and gradually put my foot into metaphysics, and I had to deal with, like, when working on the problem of evil, a lot of these issues. And then it was really weird listening to a lot of the ideas that I was kind of, tossing around in my head, because I started noticing that, like, the traditional way of doing Thomism just, I started seeing some problems with it. And then the solutions that you guys were talking about, I noticed that these were things that I was also thinking about on the side. And it was just really nice to see, like, oh, okay, I was actually onto something. It wasn't something crazy, right? So there's a lot of great content here. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And
thank you for having me on, man.
Yeah, no problem. I enjoyed this so much. And I'm going to stop the episode here. So have a great day, guys.
You too.
Okay, take
Yep.